sector. They have to play the long game, and they have to make the...
Over the last few years, Kenya's rising debt has been a point of discussion in most macroeconomic outlook discourses, with organizations such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, global credit rating agencies, and the African Development Bank, among others, raising concerns. It is for this reason that today, the conversation revolved around Kenya's debt burden and if there's a reason for Kenya to be concerned. Kwame Owino, CEO, Institute of Economic Affairs, went ahead to say as much as Kenya is not in a debt crisis yet, all the red flags are pointing towards debt stress.
I think the debt refinancing, that's clear. I mean, if you're going to have to say, for instance, we borrow money when our Eurobond or when our main debts, syndicated loans and all those became. So from the first Eurobond alone, the first Eurobond alone, part of the proceeds actually was used to pay an earlier debt, right? Which is a syndicated loan and everything else. So that's what we do. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing. To take a cheaper loan to pay an expensive loan is not a bad thing. Except in the last two cycles of our Eurobond, every time we've borrowed, we are borrowing at a more expensive rate to pay a loan, that's whatever. So that in itself is already early signs of debt stress, in the sense that you have to make your obligations come through, but the only way you're doing that is borrowing more expensively to pay for a cheaper loan. That's not the way it should be. It's the reverse, which is what tells me that we shouldn't describe this as a crisis, but we're already in a situation of stress where government is actually borrowing expensive loan to pay others.
Supplementary budget, because that's when a lot of that shifting happened.
The same tone was picked up by Nzese Were, a development economist, who pointed out that Kenya's debt woes are because of its poor financial credibility, making borrowing for Kenya tougher.
So I think we need to really work on strengthening our institutions, but also understanding that there are just some things that will take time, and sadly, we can do what we can, but I think other countries have shown us. I think in terms of refinancing, I'm not very optimistic. I'm with Kwame here. I think given the fiscal credibility issues Kenya has, no matter where they're going for the money, the terms are going to be a lot tougher. It's going to be a lot more expensive, and the tenure is going to be shorter. I think that's why, even if you see in Kwame's presentation, people don't want to hang on to government debt for a long time. They just don't. And that's why you're seeing shorter and shorter tenures. So as long as government demonstrates that it's having serious problems with fiscal management, it will be very difficult to get cheap loans in a long tenure.
We'll have more money as we get more money.
Nzese further went on to say that it will only get easier if Kenya resignals its fiscal policy.
That will only change when there's demonstrated reorientation of fiscal policy and there is signaling to domestic and international market that it makes sense to hold on to Kenyan debt. So until that fiscal credibility issue is managed, I don't think government will have a way of that. I think in terms of the infrastructure and the multiplier effect, well, I think that's an argument that Asia has used.
The revenue generation is not growing at the pace that government wants.
Most of the debt accrued by Kenya is always channeled into infrastructure development. However, Kwame says not all debt-funded projects have been successful, hence stalling the expected multiplier effect.
I mean, the government itself has to admit that not every infrastructure project that we've invested in the last even 10 years has been successful. I mean, the Thika Road, the Thika Superhighway is an outlier in Kenya's infrastructure development. One, it was developed, the costs were fairly modest in all factors considered, and yes, it's led definitely to some positive things, but there are other infrastructure things. So for instance, the last mile. I think if you hear, whether it was the Jubilee Manifesto or more recently you hear that Kenya expanded power to 4 million new homes, and while we did that, Kenya Power faced losses of income, and some of the 600,000 people who were connected to power did not pay their bills at the end of the month. So if you had that as an investment, obviously the returns on that investment tells you that maybe you could have spent the same amount of money for a different purpose and got that. So it's clear, some of those are things we're going to have to live with. Those investments are not going to pay off in the medium term.
Thank you for your insights.
Nzese equally stated that not all infrastructure projects translate into economic development, since most projects are overpriced and characterized with misappropriation of funds.
The reality is that if the project is overpriced and the money is not used efficiently, that multiplier effect will not materialize. So I think the assumption that infrastructure equals growth and development is a fallacy, and it actually prevents government from being responsible to deliver what it should be delivering.
Growing at the pace that it should be growing at. So I think looking at revenue.
Kenya's public debt is projected to hit 7 trillion by the time His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta exits State House. According to a report by National Treasury Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich, the country's debt burden will hit 5.6 trillion Kenya shillings by June next year.
Unless there is something buried.
The annual public debt management report was tabled in the National Assembly by Leader of Majority Aden Duale further shows that the national debt as at June this year, both domestic and foreign, stood at 5.1 trillion Kenya shillings. Domestic debt stands at 2.5 trillion, while foreign debt has hit 2.6 trillion Kenya shillings. The country has equally received 559.1 billion Kenya shillings from China, 101.9 billion Kenya shillings from Italy, and 34.7 billion Kenya shillings from Germany. Other creditors are Belgium, who issued 10.2 billion Kenya shillings, and the USA 2.9 billion Kenya shillings. International Development Association IDA has also contributed to the debt burden by loaning the country 516.8 billion Kenya shillings. African Development Bank has extended a 204.8 billion Kenya shillings facility, while International Monetary Fund IMF has given a 71.6 billion Kenya shillings loan.
When we concluded
With the ever-growing concerns of the country debt sustainability, what remains is for the concerned stakeholders to take decisive action before the country plunges into an economic crisis.
100 billion worth of spending every year.